Antarctica's Weddell Sea is the tomb of one of exploration's greatest legends, the Endurance, Sir Ernest Shackleton's ship, crushed by the ice in 1915, an eternal symbol of the indomitable fury of polar nature. It's a story we've come to admire, a glorious tragedy. But forget everything you thought you knew. The truth is brutal and shocking. The Endurance was not the victim of the blind fury of the ice, but rather of a catastrophic failure, a deadly secret that lay within its hull since before it set sail. And most revolting, its legendary captain, Ernest Shackleton, knew this and chose to ignore, or worse, hide the truth, condemning his own expedition and crew to a foretold tragedy in pursuit of his own glory. His ship was fatally wounded before leaving port. For over a century, we have idolized a man who, in his thirst to escape his troubles and etch his name into history, may have betrayed the trust of every man on board. The official version of history has always been etched in stone. The heroic Shackleton, after 9 months of imprisonment, saw his majestic ship succumb to the crushing pressure of pack ice, a natural phenomenon no one could have predicted or prevented. It was the perfect image of a leader facing the impossible, whose only flaw was underestimating Antarctica. However, this carefully constructed narrative is beginning to crumble under the weight of discoveries brought by a new and rigorous study, led by naval architecture expert Yuka Takuri, who was on the expedition that located the ship's remains in 2022. What Takuri found, examining the submerged remains and cross-referencing data with the crew's journals, was not the trace of an unequal battle against the thickest ice on the planet, but rather indisputable proof of a primary and unacceptable structural vulnerability. It's a scenario that suggests a disaster that was entirely avoidable, transforming the tragedy into a scandal of recklessness and irresponsibility that dishonors the hero's image. By analyzing the ghostly hull of the Endurance at a depth of over 3,000 meters, science has uncovered the true cause of the implosion, etched in the wreckage with harrowing clarity. Researcher Takuri immediately noticed that the vessel's hull lacked the lateral structural beams necessary to withstand the infernal cycle of ice compression and decompression that characterizes the most extreme polar regions, such as the Weddell Sea. When the ice finally tightened, it wasn't Antarctica that won, it was the engineering flaw that manifested itself. The pressure found the weakness. First, it pulverized the rudder, taking away maneuverability. It then crushed the stern and irreversibly compromised the keel, the ship's backbone, opening cracks that filled the hull with cold, relentless water. This wasn't a weakness resulting from time in the ice, it was a congenital disease of the ship, a flaw in its construction that doomed it from the moment the expedition plan was drawn up. The great and painful revelation, however, shifts the focus from the material failure to the moral judgment of one of history's most celebrated explorers. The scandal deepens when we compare Shackleton's public record in his book, South, a memoir of the Endurance voyage, where he insists on the invincibility of ice as the main villain, with what he confided behind the scenes. A thorough analysis of his most personal writings reveals a terrifying cynicism. In an intimate and revealing letter to his wife, Emily, Shackleton bluntly admits that the Endurance was a far less robust vessel than the Nimrod, the ship he used on his previous polar expedition in 1908. This is the silent confession of one who plays with fire. The expedition leader was fully aware of his ship's structural inferiority, but chose to lie or omit it in order to protect the funding, image and continuity of his project, allowing the ship's structural fragility to be masked under the cloak of bravery and polar fatality. And to amplify the sense of betrayal, the new study shows that Shackleton was no novice who could plead ignorance about the strengthening needs of polar vessels. On the contrary, he had gained crucial practical experience alongside German explorer Wilhelm Filchner, helping him equip his ship, the Deutschland, with precisely the kind of structural strengthening beams that were carelessly omitted, or perhaps deliberately skimped on, in the design of the Endurance. The definitive proof that Shackleton knew what he was doing lies in the German ship's fate. In 1912, the Deutschland faced the same ice hell in the Weddell Sea, drifting and trapped for a comparable 8 long months, but thanks to the strengthening Shackleton helped implement, it survived intact. This shocking precedent rules out the possibility that the Endurance's sinking was an unforeseen accident. It was, in reality, a miscalculation, a dangerous economy, or, worse, a desperate gamble by a man already mired in debt and pressed for time. The anguish of this irresponsible decision is felt through the desperate words of the crew, who testified in their diaries to the ship's structural agony, even if they didn't understand why. Researcher Takuri found records of at least 5 severe ice compression events that revealed the alarming lack of reinforcement, with engineer Reginald James's diaries being particularly revealing. James writes of the unbearable pressure concentrated in the engine room, which he describes as the epicenter of the instability and where, ironically, the strength beams simply didn't exist. Captain Frank Worsley corroborates James's apprehension, documenting in his logs that the engine room was unquestionably the weakest point of the entire ship. These men knew the ship was giving way far more easily than it should have. They were, in fact, aboard a ship that wasn't just in the ice. It was being devoured by an inherent weakness that the captain, perhaps in his haste or distraction, chose to overlook. The backdrop to Shackleton's reckless decision isn't simply an engineering negligence, but extends to an existential crisis, adding a devastating layer of personal drama to the catastrophe. As Professor Michael Bravo points out, in the era of the great polar expeditions, time and money often trumped safety, and many ships were merely hastily adapted second-hand hulks. However, journalist Michael Smith, in his biography of the explorer, plunges us into the depths of the leader's darkness. He reveals that, on the eve of the voyage, Shackleton was mired in a turbulent sea of crushing financial debt and a marriage crumbling under the weight of the marital crisis. This expedition to the South Pole, far from being just a noble quest for knowledge, became a desperate escape, a means of sinking one's teeth into something grand, of silencing one's personal demons, and of competing with rivals who had already achieved glory. This is the bitter and definitive conclusion that unravels the enigma of the Endurance. The ship, although at the mercy of the ice, was in fact hostage to financial circumstances, the rush of the competition, and, above all, the emotional and personal chaos of its commander. Shackleton's desperate need to escape his problems and regain fame eclipsed prudence, leading him to risk everything, including the lives of his men, on a ship he knew was inferior and ill-prepared. The real drama, therefore, is not the crushed ship, but the masked responsibility, a completely avoidable disaster that occurred because the hero was too busy battling his inner demons to pay attention to what was fatally visible. The ultimate irony lies in the fact that the Endurance, the ship that could not withstand the ordeal, became the symbol of a legendary resistance that, at heart, was a story of incompetence hidden by urgency and ego. Faced with this disturbing revelation, where structural negligence and the personal turmoil of a historical hero intertwine to seal the fate of an entire expedition, the story of the Endurance shifts from an epic of survival to a tragedy of responsibility. Have you ever stopped to think how many disasters, in our own history, personal or collective, have been attributed to fate or uncontrollable forces, when in fact they were the direct result of concealed human error, irresponsible haste, or a secret kept by someone in a position of power? We want to hear your honest opinion. What do you think about this new face of Shackleton? Is he a tragic hero who was a victim of circumstance, or an irresponsible leader who put his crew in danger for personal reasons? Have you ever seen anything like this happen in your life, or do you know of a case where the truth behind a failure was more shocking than the event itself? Leave your comment now, tell us how you felt about this revelation, and let's discuss this topic, which is, in fact, much deeper than it seems. And to not miss any of our next shocking revelations, do your curiosity a favor, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and, crucially, turn on the notification bell. We post shocking and revealing videos like this every day.